Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Andrea Telly, and I'm commissioner of the Chicago Public Library. I kind of am still in a little disbelief because it's a new job for me. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I want to say actually that my name is Andrea Mark Telly because that's going to be important in a minute. And I want to thank you all for coming to the celebration of the life of our Michael. By way of getting started, I met Michael Flug about 30 years ago when I started here in the Special Collections Department at Chicago Public Library as an archivist. After telling him my name, Andrea Mark, he asked if I was Jewish. And I said, no, close, I'm Italian. And he asked, how do you have a name like Mark? And so I told him that when my grandfather, Vincenzo Marchigiani, left Italy and got to Ellis Island, probably without any papers, but we welcomed him anyway, the fellow at immigration said, "I'm sorry, Vince, that'll never go. Your name is Mark." So that's how we got the name Mark. Well, that wasn't good enough for Michael, so from that moment on, he used to call me Dr. Marchigiani. So he never stopped calling me that. And so from that moment on, we started a love affair over grilled octopus, family histories, travel, and collecting history. And it's a love affair that didn't stop. All of this is to say that Michael was never just okay with the surface of a person or an event or anything. He needed to know more. And it's from that need to know us deeply and completely that he leaves us with what's here all around us. Family, friendship, fellowship, and love. So God bless you, Michael, for what you've done today. Look at this. This is incredible. So I have one more thing. I have a statement from Mayor Lori Lightfoot that I would like to read. Lori and her wife, Amy, are staunch supporters of the library, and First Lady Amy Eshelman worked here at CPL and knew Michael for many years. So I have this statement. So the statement is, Michael Flug spent a lifetime as a devoted champion and chronicler of the African American experience in Chicago and beyond. With his guardianship, the Vivian G. Harsh Collection of Afro-American History and Literature grew to become the largest collection of its kind in the Midwest and a Chicago treasure. Students, genealogists, and scholars of all ages have and will continue to benefit from his deep knowledge and commitment to keeping the stories of our history alive. On behalf of the City of Chicago, Amy, Vivian, and myself, we offer deep gratitude to Michael and heartfelt condolences to his wife, Suzanne, his family, and friends. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lou Turner. I had the privilege of having Michael Flug as my best friend and having it returned in the same, in that he considered me his best friend, obviously outside of Suzanne. I've known Michael since 1975 in Detroit, so there's kind of two Michaels. There's a Detroit Michael and there is a Chicago Michael. I won't get back into the Brooklyn Michael since I'm from New Jersey. We always have these things. But I've been asked to kind of get us through the proceedings today. I'm out of uniform. I'm actually wearing a suit. I learned that from Michael, the protocol of when you wear a suit and when you wear jeans, because Michael was an organizer, is an activist, as well as a world-class archivist and scholar of the African American experience. Very often, Michael would say that sometimes, particularly around Black History Month, when it seems like all the schools in Chicago would send their students to Woodson to do projects on Black History Month, and he'd be inundated with kids Michael's knowledge of the African-American experience. If sight unseen, most people thought that Michael himself was African-American, or at least must have been Creole or something. So, but no, Michael was devoted at a very young age to the civil rights movement and to the black movement for social justice. Suzanne, do you want me to read the thing? This is in pretty much his own words, and I think if you haven't gotten it, you should. It gives you, because as much as people will be speaking today and showing the multidimensionality of Michael Flug, hearing some of it in his own words, I think helps. I was a non-political 15-year-old high school student, and you'll see this depicted in the photograph display that Suzanne and her sons put together, Michael and Kevin. I was a non-political 15-year-old high school student in New York in March 1960. A black psychology professor active in CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, met with the social club to which I belonged and suggested that the club members support the new sit-in movement in the South by joining the CORE picket line at a Woolworth store in downtown Brooklyn. Although I didn't think much of the idea, I went to the demonstration. The picket line, which called on shoppers to boycott Woolworths, was stunningly successful. For me, it was a liberating experience, which began 7 years of participation in CORE. I joined CORE in March 1960, organized high school CORE chapters, participated in picket lines and demonstrations to support public accommodation sit-ins in the South. Active in CORE's Freedom Highways campaign, 1961 to 62, sit-ins at segregated bus terminal facilities and restaurants in North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, participated in Durham, North Carolina downtown desegregation movement, member of CORE Employment Council in New York, 1962 to 64, assisted in planning and organizing consumer boycotts and demonstrations to force major corporations that sold consumer products and services in the black community to hire black workers. Other targets included construction, skilled trade employers, and Jim Crow unions with mass picketing and civil disobedience at construction sites. Participated in Maryland Eastern Shore and Baltimore CORE projects, 1963 to 64, active in Cambridge and Princess Anne, Maryland demonstrations. Worked with Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to challenge Democratic Convention in Mississippi and in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1964. With the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Watts Rebellion in 1965, like many other civil rights activists, I searched for new pathways to deepen the movement. On the one hand, I became involved in the study of black history and radical thought, which led to a 2-decade-long association with Marxist humanist thinkers Raya Dostoevskaya and Charles Demby, who was a black production worker at Chrysler in Detroit. On the other hand, I concentrated on the 1965 CORE support campaigns for unionization of black and other minority poverty wage workers. Worked with organizing campaigns for hospital and cafeteria workers, and with CORE support for both Mississippi Freedom Labor Union and the National Farm Workers Association strikes. Field Secretary of CORE, 1966 to 67, one of the original developers of the plan for CORE-sponsored Maryland Freedom Union in Baltimore, or Baltimore as he always corrected me. This independent community-based union was open to all non-union poverty wage workers in Baltimore, assisted self-organization of black women, retail, hospital, nursing home workers, and organized community support demonstrations and boycott activities. For my article on the Maryland Freedom Union, see the Civil Rights Movement's Challenge to Organize Labor, the case of the Maryland Freedom Union. It's in the journal Labor History, summer of 1990. That's just a piece of Michael's very, very, very active life. You can see he's somebody who was in the trenches. He was at the grassroots. He heard that message from the grassroots, and he was there. And when I met him in 1975, I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and I came to my first News and Letters meeting. News and Letters was the name of the organization and the newspaper that we both belonged to, and he was showing me around Detroit. And I said, this place is so ugly, man, you can't do anything but make a revolution here. And from that day on, we were very close friends. One of the things, actually there's two things I want to say about Michael, and then I'll start calling people to give their remembrances of Michael. You'll see, as I mentioned before, a very multidimensional human being. He was fully human. He was a mensch, as it's called. He was somebody who always was trying to find the best in other people and helping other people. But there's two things that I was thinking about that go to the character of Michael, and I think kind of covers many people in this room. The first one is purpose, and the second one is people. The first one, purpose, is that if you were someone, and many of the people in this room are these kinds of people, someone who has decided to live a life with purpose. Michael was the purpose behind that purpose. Michael was the one who helped you fulfill and realize the purpose for which you lived. As a researcher, as a scholar, as a writer, as an activist, as an historian, he was the person that you went to help you realize, to fulfill your purpose, to not so much speak truth to power, that can get you killed sometimes, but to speak truth to the people. So we need to flip that around. So he was somebody who helped you realize what you were doing. There's more than a dozen books that he was responsible for helping researchers write who came down to the Harsh. He's somebody, if you had purpose and you were serious, he was serious with you. And it's that kind of thing that I remember very much about Michael, perhaps most about Michael, because it's selfless. It's selfless. In a world in which everything is kind of social media and me, and we got somebody in the White House like that, selflessness and service is very, very important. And as an organizer who is helping people to attain the greatest of purposes, freedom, and finding that particularly in the Black community, in Black struggles for freedom, was really the purpose of Michael. And if you were serious about that, he was serious with you. The second thing has to do with people. And this is kind of a funny one. It's an interesting one, but I think a lot of people who ever came to Harsh, or even before Harsh, even at parallel with Harsh, who are doing research, a dissertation, a book, an article, Michael would help you find your audience. When you write, when you speak, when you communicate, like I'm trying to do now, you always have to consider who your audience is. It's what you come to a library for if you're doing research. It isn't just to do the research, but to do the research in order to communicate something, to communicate ideas to an audience. Who is your audience? And Michael would help you find that. He helped you to write more concretely, more expressively, and in a way that would go beyond the audience you thought you had to the people outside. And so audience for him was always the people. And if you kept that in mind, you could always write much more powerfully and really realize what it is that you came in the library for in the first place. He helped you find your audience, a broader audience, and to write and communicate in a way that was more expressive than you began with. I always remember Michael from Detroit all the way up to his last years over at Harsh. Anytime I went with him, he always had a yellow legal pad and taking notes. I think everybody remembers that. And he took everyone seriously like that. Even the little kids that came in African American History Month, he would help them in that way. But to be able to communicate with someone, to communicate with others, to communicate ideas, particularly ideas of freedom, that was Michael's purpose in life. And he helped you to connect with your audience. There's some people the world can't afford to lose. And Michael was one of them. With that, I'll turn over go to the speakers list. We had Commissioner Telly, and our next speaker is someone that I know from the University of Illinois, which is at Champaign-Urbana, which is where I am, and he's now at Northwestern University, and that's Professor Chris Benson. He's in the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University.
Thank you. Thank you, Lou, for all you've done to help bring this to life, and especially for your comments, which are both elegant and eloquent. Thank you for being a friend and colleague as well, and also a friend of Michael. In the spirit of Michael, I should say, in preserving the record, let's everybody smile for a selfie. We got to preserve the record. He would not forgive me if I didn't document everything, so here we go. There, great. So it's family and friends and colleagues, this is indeed a special honor for me to be here to take part in this celebration of a life, a significant life, a life well lived. I have to say, I will never forget my first encounter with Michael Flug. I am sure that's true of so many of us here who came to know him, but there was something quite special, quite touching, quite memorable about my first encounter. That's because he blew me off. Okay, a little bit of setup is required here. It was January 2013. I was under pressure. I was under contract with Random House to deliver a manuscript, 100,000 words, April 1st. Did I mention this is January? Okay, so I was under contract to deliver the manuscript of Mamie Till Mobley's story, the story of the life and the brutal lynching of her son, Emmett Till. I had worked with Mother Mobley during the previous 6 months, the last 6 months of her life, as it turned out, the 6 months that she dedicated to preserving her story. She died in January 2013. Despite the fact that I had talked with her extensively over the many hours and days and weeks during her last 6 months, despite the facts that I had gathered, probing her memory and the memories of so many family, friends, and historians, I felt that I needed something more context, more meaning. The late Doris Saunders, a dear friend and author and longtime librarian and archivist at Johnson Publishing Company, suggested that I reach out to Michael. I did, and he blew me off. Did I mention this was January 2013? He certainly reminded me of that fact and the fact that January comes before February, and February is Black History Month, and as you heard, it was kind of a busy time for Michael. He was busy, and of course, I asked, too busy? I'm nothing if not persistent, and he said yes, emphatically. He was nothing if not consistent. Even so, he took a moment of his precious time during this period to hear me out. And once he heard Emmett Till, he began to do that Michael thing with the yellow pad. And the wheels started turning, and he began processing, and the gazillion terabytes of information are called up, and he finally said to me, this is an important story. And we, meaning everybody at the Vivian T. Harsh collection, and you know who you are, everyone wants to be part of it, which is an incredible moment. Of course, I had to swear out an oath of allegiance, promised to do my first book event, a major public lecture of the story at the Woodson, and once we did that, drew a little blood, we began to work together. And he does require that you take your work seriously, because he's going to take your work seriously. So however busy he must have been in those weeks leading up to the special Black History Month events at the Woodson Library, it never showed. He spent so much time pulling file boxes and microfiche and photographs and recordings to place at my disposal. Ultimately, he helped me place all those stories Mother Mobley had shared, to place them in a context that elevated her story and ours, a story, an American story of deliverance. We went on to work together on the WTTW documentary Paper Trail, 100 Years of the Chicago Defender, the award-winning story brilliantly produced by Barbara Allen. He had been saving for that moment as well the file boxes and folders and photographs and recordings, the stories that formed the story. He had no time, but he made the time, and that was always true of Michael once he took you seriously. In fact, it didn't take long to understand that often with Michael, no was his MO. After all, an initial no gave him leverage to negotiate the terms of the eventual yes. No made that eventual yes so much more valued, so much more appreciated, and we certainly continue to appreciate him and his contributions to our work. Michael, in a sense, was a scholar, but not in the strictly academic sense, not in the way scholars recognize each other, but he went the way of the scholar, certainly, and he carried with him the body of scholarship on practically everything. He was a walking, breathing, living, lit review, a human resource. He was not a scholar in the traditional sense, but he made us all smarter, the way a scholar might. He never questioned our dedication, but he demonstrated what true dedication is, what true dedication should be, what true dedication requires. He did not question our dedication, but he caused it to become so much stronger. He didn't narrate our stories, but he helped to contextualize them, to give them meaning, to make them resonate and inspire and endure. He shared with us the wealth of his accumulated knowledge, experiential and tangible, through documents and recordings and artifacts. He was a collector. He collected things, yes, but mostly he collected stories. He truly was Chicago's finest, pledged to preserve and protect. Talking with Michael was like joining him on an archaeological dig, moving methodically through all the socio-political strata of rights and wrongs and accomplishments. He's not a credited writer on that vast body of work he accredited, but clearly he has shaped so much important written work. He did not win the awards. He was not named on them, but he provided so much toward earning them, a Pulitzer nomination and a Robert F. Kennedy Award for the Mamie Till Mobley book, several Emmys and a Peter Lisagor Journalism Award for the Chicago Defender documentary, and so much more. He was not about awards. He was not about recognition, the attaboys. He was all about what was next, all about time management. He was more than a senior archivist. He was a collaborator, an interrogator, an instigator. For me, for so many of us, he also was a friend. My first encounter with Michael Flug, he blew me off. He didn't have time. He wound up taking the time, making the time, again and again and again. For Emmett Till, for the Chicago Defender, for DuSable to Obama, for the Negro in Illinois, and so many other works that were important and continue to tell our story. Now, at a time when we need him most, when there are so many important stories to tell, so much need to enlighten public discourse, now when he undoubtedly would have the perfect file, folder, photograph, or personal story to help us make sense of this moment, he ran out of time. I'll never forget the precious time he shared with me and the questions he caused me to pose and the resourcefulness he inspired in me to find the answers. And yes, this too, the critical thinking skills he helped to sharpen in that dynamic process of asking questions, answering questions, and then questioning the answers. For that, I'm eternally grateful to Michael and for all the time he gave me, and through his memory, the time he gives us still. In the memories in the stories, in the lessons of a life well lived, a purposeful life, as we heard from Lou. Seize the time, squeeze the time, get 2 hours of enrichment out of every hour we are given, and always, always live on purpose. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Amy Eshelman. I'm here representing my wife, Mayor Lori Lightfoot. I had the privilege and honor to be a colleague of Michael's for 18 years while I was here at the Chicago Public Library. And I just ironically saw Mary Dempsey, the former commissioner, yesterday morning, and we were talking a lot about our trips down to Woodson and to Harsh, and how much we really enjoyed talking to Michael about projects and his incredible feedback. Mary said it was always a great give and take with Michael. We'd have one idea, he'd come back with another. So we loved the opportunity to work with him. So I have a letter from Lori to Suzanne, Michael, and Kevin, just expressing our condolences and our great appreciation for the public servant that Michael was, but in particular for the human being that Michael was, and what he did for not only the city, but I think across the country, just his leadership around the excellence he put into his work is just second to none. So the Chicago Public Library is so much better for having him here. The city of Chicago is so much better for having him here. So thank you very much, and our deepest condolences and sympathy. Thank you.
If you're following the program, we're not following the program. I have a different list, so if you, sorry about that, should have made that plain. The next speaker that we have is Beverly Cook. She's the archivist of the Harsh Research Collection at Woodson Regional Library on the far south side, where Michael used to work.
I was supposed to be last, Lou. You were really not following the program. Michael, my friend. Michael Flug was one of a kind. I was fortunate to have Michael as a colleague and as a friend. He was the ultimate teacher, even though he claimed that he could not teach. I see his handiwork in the students who were part of the Map and Stack project from the University of Chicago. All of these interns have gone on to stellar careers in academia, even writing their own books and stuff. But what was most important to Michael was the knowledge of how to use an archive that was being passed on to countless students via their classrooms. Indeed, I see many writers in this audience today who benefited from Michael's help and knowledge. He was a composite human being in that he took the early experiences as a community activist and as a civil rights activist into the rest of his life. Once you got on his radar, you were there, you were captured for life. Michael would engage you in politics, Black history, and religion. These were just a few of the things that he could converse on. There was not a subject under the sun that Michael couldn't talk for days on, okay? People would say that Michael was not a religious man, even though he was of Jewish background. But that wasn't true. Michael was the most spiritual human being that I had the pleasure of knowing. His problem was that he did not believe that organized religion had kept true to its thesis of working and taking care of the community and of the people, of the little man. helping the little guy, as he called him. He loved his gospel music, especially Sweet Honey in the Rock, and his slick mustard greens, which he would always call my mother when I wasn't at home and tell her to fix him some, which would mean that me or my sister Shirley would have to track on the south side to find some slick mustard greens. And when she cooked them, it wasn't a little container. I usually had to take a whole pot of mustard greens to work for Michael. Now this is saying something, because Suzanne does not like greens. Michael taught me archival administration theories and realities and practicalities that are not written in manuals or taught in classes. He gave me a background of civil rights history from the bird's eye view of being a part of the movement. He introduced me to leaders from all walks of life whose passion was still evident even though time had moved on. He had the patience to listen, to teach, to argue, and yet remain friends. Then there are those things that he taught all of us simply by being Michael. He taught us how to be patient, how to be loyal in the face of adversity, how to stand steadfast in the face of trouble, how to be both colleague and friend, how to motivate donors, and indeed people of all life into giving of themselves. He was an excellent writer. He should have been spending time writing books, but instead he spent his time helping academia and scholars and documentarians tell the stories. I don't think there's anyone in this room who has not been the recipient of that red pen editing of something that you asked Michael to read, R-E-A-D, okay? I want to send out a special shout and a thank you to Suzanne, Michael, and Kevin for sharing him with us. He made us a part of their family circle, and we are indeed grateful for their forbearance and their generosity. A former colleague called me yesterday and said that to know Michael was a blessing. She was right. So I am not saying goodbye, because he lives on in our memories, he lives on in our stories, and he lives on in the life lessons that he taught us, and that we, if we learn from him, will pass on to the next generation. So rest not, my friend. Your job is done. Thank you.
As the embassy, I get the privilege to give you a little vignette of Michael's. We returned to the South, Michael returned to the South in the 1980s to document what was a unsung and unwritten about social movement amongst low-wage workers. We call it sweated labor, sweated wage workers in the Mississippi Delta, mostly in the catfish industry. These were mostly black women who were organizing a union. They organized 11 plants in the Mississippi Delta. The last time a whole industry was organized was back in the 1930s with the CIO. This is in the 1980s during deindustrialization all over the country, but in the South, there emerged a very important labor movement that we went down to document, and that's when we met one of the great leaders of that movement, Sarah White, who's very, very close to Michael. Lori Green is here. She'll talk more about some of that experience in the South as well. But when we drove down the first time together, we got stopped at coming back in Cairo, Illinois. And everybody shakes their head. Cairo was up south. And they stopped us, the police stopped us, because they couldn't imagine that two guys, one black and one white, couldn't be anything but drug dealers. And so we got stopped. But we had a lot of adventures in the South. One of them was running into Bob Moses, who everyone knows from 1964, Mississippi Freedom Summer, and the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, and the Freedom Schools in the South. And Bob had returned to the South to start the Algebra Project in the South. Actually, the project had started up in the North in Boston. But he had taken the project back south. Michael was convinced that there was an organizing purpose behind the Algebra Project, behind math. and that teaching these kids math using their own communities to teach algebra was an organizing ploy by Bob Moses. I wasn't that convinced, but over the years, and going back there, we heard from Bob Moses's colleague, Dave Dennis, who was running the project out of Jackson, a story about a school in North Carolina in which a corporation had funded the algebra project in this little town in North Carolina. And when the students start using, as an example of algebra, the runoff from that corporation into the water supply, the corporation cut the funding off. So he was right. there was an organizing principle behind algebra, and Michael can talk on it for forever. The next speaker that we have is Denise English, who's from the Harsh Research Collection. She's a preservationist at the Harsh.
Hello, my name is Denise English, and a few of us here today got to know Michael through work. Michael and I worked at the Carter G. Woodson Regional Library. I met him on my first day of work at Woodson in October of 1993. We got to talking about things. If you know Michael, you know some of his questions. Was I from Chicago? Where did I go to high school? Where did my grandparents come from? Did I have any people from Mississippi? I told him that I also had a master's degree in African American World Studies. And 6 months later, on June 15th, 1994, I would be working in the Vivian G. Harsh Research Collection of Afro-American History and Literature with Michael. While working in the Harsh Collection, Michael never seemed to me the researcher he couldn't help or assist in one way or another, whether it was through the Harsh Collection or some other source he knew about. Through the years, we shared our love of sports, especially baseball and the Chicago White Sox. Michael even told me he used to pitch. We both loved to witness pitching duels, an elusive no-hit or perfect game. We cheered when the White Sox won the World Series in 2005, and Mark Burley no-hitter and perfect game in 2007 and 2009. And we later mourned the trading of pitcher Chris Sale in 2016. We strategized and collaborated on the NCAA tournament brackets on our lunch break and continued to hope for greater success for the for the Bulls. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry, Michael, I should not have said that. And continued greater success for the Bears and the Bulls. Whether you were researchers, fellow archivists, co-workers, friends, or family, we are all here because somehow, somewhere, we have all been touched by Michael Flug. He was a cherished colleague, a scholar, and a friend who will be missed by all, but never will be forgotten by those who were fortunate enough to have known him. Thank you.
Our next speaker, again, we're following this and not this, is Professor Lori Green from the University of Texas at Austin. Lori has a long history with Michael as well, both in news and letters and beyond. So, Professor Green. I didn't make the list.
But I still had 5 people to go. So I have scribbles, and I'm going to read them, and I hope that it works. It was just so hard to figure out what to focus in on because I met Michael in Detroit when I was about, 22 or 3. And that means I've known him for a really long time. No, I've lived in Austin for the last 15 years, and so I had to rely on the phone, on email, and on breakfast at Pauline's when I came to town. So, like other people, I have a first impression too. It's interesting how many of us have that first moment impression. So my impression was this: a Brooklyn talking, black briefcase carrying, filled with determination, mind set on freedom, deep with thoughtfulness, compassion, and a sense of humor that I could get being from New Jersey. And of course, I took a lot about being from New Jersey. Michael taught me that ideas aren't possessions, which sometimes I think they are in academia at Research One universities. They're ideas, that ideas matter, that they go beyond the individual person, though they come from individuals, that they're not possessions of intellectuals, that the relationships between working class people's ideas and those of intellectuals like Michael, steeped in history, philosophy, and experience, that those ideas matter. And so, like Lou was mentioning, I wanted to share one of the highlights of my experience was I wasn't in the car with Lou and Mike on that trip, but maybe on the next trip, we were driving to Indianola, Mississippi, which is right in the middle of the Delta, and down the road from where Fannie Lou Hamer lived. And we were going to see Sarah White, who they met on this earlier trip, and she was like the next Fannie Lou Hamer. She was a single mother who became a worker in a catfish processing plant when they tore out the cotton fields and dug out these enormous enormous catfish ponds with like 10,000 catfish in each of them. So I'm sorry to say that I haven't eaten Mississippi catfish since then. But this was someone who overcame her shyness and became the leader of the largest strike in the South, as Lou said, in decades, a strike of black women that the owners assumed would never step out of place despite their carpal tunnel syndrome, despite the inhumane conditions, despite so much more, and create that strike. I think that, maybe you can confirm, Suzanne, I think that a life project of Michael's was helping Sarah write out her ideas and her life story, her autobiography. He still had that black briefcase, determination, mind on freedom, listening, Brooklyn talk, and sense of humor on that trip, and I could kind of go on with a lot of memories, but I will not. I'll spare you that. And I just want to just share one other little memory and then close. So I was teaching, when I finished my degree, I had a year of teaching at the University of Chicago, and I was teaching a civil rights class that was both undergrads and master's students. And so I kept talking about, you could go do research at the Harsh. And no one knew what that was, and no one had heard about the Carter G. Woodson Library. So this is there in Hyde Park. So we took a bus trip. Michael helped me organize a bus trip to the South Side. And he took my students to 3 places. Of course, we started at the Harsh. And then he took us to the George Cleveland Hall Public Library, where people from the Writers Project would have meetings and argue Richard Wright, and all those folks from the Chicago Renaissance would argue things out at that and read each other's work at that place. And then he took us to the Southside Community Arts Center. And I was just hearing from Beverly that they're doing a wonderful job in restoring making that a place that you can still go to. So we took a trip to the South Side. We took a trip to the South Side in the 1930s. And I had students that cried at the end of that trip. They had not known so much, and Michael had just grabbed all of them. It was so important. So we're saying goodbye, but we all have that. Thank you.
The next speaker is Robert Miller, who is the curator of the Harsh Research Collection. Bob?
You know, I had a speech and everything written, and I said, you know what? I was telling Beverly, who was my first assistant, I said, you know, everybody's going to say the same thing, and I'm going to keep hearing the same thing. And I said, everybody's going to know because I've written just about everything that everybody's talked about. The first thing I remember about Michael is I was sent to ALA because I had experience of interviewing people at ALA. And we needed 3 reference people for the second floor, Woodson Regional Library Reference Department. And I went up there, I sat down, I did my thing. I interviewed 3 people and hired 3 people, recommended that they be hired. One of them was Michael Flug. Michael Flug had good credentials, and we were looking for 3 kinds of people. One that had some interest in science, Durga Papula, and then someone had an interest in literature, Cara Williams. And then there was Michael Flug, who had a strong interest in history. And one of my mandates was to try and help develop these departments on the second floor. So, okay, you hired Michael. Michael came to the second floor. Michael's charm was immediately noticed. Everybody knew Michael. He talked to Michael, and he asked the same questions that he asked everybody. Where are you from? What high school did you go to? What? Oh, yeah, you're from North Carolina? Okay. And then we had a leak in our roof. Then I saw the real Michael. The real Michael, the organizer, the union man, the troublemaker, the guy. And then I saw his literary skills. He wrote these powerful press releases about this terrible thing that's happening at Woodson, and it was a hole in the roof, and it's leaking and ruining all the books and everything. And he managed to get this press release. He was one of the best press release writers I've ever seen. And then the next thing I know, I was marching off to an organizational meeting that we were having at a church. And we went out there and we had this meeting. And the next thing I know, we were in the press, and the press was saying disgruntled employees at Woodson and all those kinds of things. I won't name the people that said it, but okay. I said, uh-oh. And I turned about several shades of red, green, and yellow, and everything else. This guy has come in here and causing some trouble. And but the next thing I know, I was writing a grant for Illinois Writers Project, which is the heart of the Harsh collection. It is a WPA project, and it was never published. And so we had the papers there, and I was writing a grant. I wrote the grant. Next thing I know, okay, I need an I wrote that we need an archivist. We didn't have any archivists in the collection at that time. There was like 2 or 3 people that worked in the collection. And Michael, I don't know how he did it, but somehow, I don't know, Michael Magic, I don't know. He managed to get a position assigned to the Harsh collection for an archivist. And so I called Archie up, Archie Motley, whom I worked with, and he welcomed me with open arms when I came to Chicago. Sometimes I wonder about why did Archie do this to me? But anyhow, Archie said, well, you know, you don't need to go out and hire an archivist. You got one right there, one of the best. He said, Michael Flug. I said, Michael Flug, okay. And so Michael, I don't know how he did it, but he managed to get a position assigned to the Harsh. And next thing I know, we were marching off first day. So I said, okay, we're going to go up to Evergreen Plaza and go to Sabaru, the pizza place, and sit down and talk. And that's when I found out the yin and the yang of what Archie had not told me. I found the yin and the yang, and I mean, we were polar opposites. Michael was well-read. I grew up in the television generation. I was a visual person. He was an activist, and he took part in everything. He made it a part of himself. He took wholehearted interest in the presentation of whatever was going on. And I was the observer. And I grew up watching television. He grew up reading. So the visual arts part collided. And I had worked at several places. I knew the same people that Michael knew, but we had opposites. He was from Brooklyn. I was from the Bronx. I grew up in a predominantly Jewish community. By my last name, we were getting all kinds of literature from the Jewish community. I was at an elementary school. I was the only 7 black kids in there. Michael went to all-black school. He talks about his social group. That ain't nothing but a gang, man. That's all that was, is a gang to me. And we had a lot of similarities. I knew the same people that he knew. One of the people we knew was Major Owens in Brooklyn. Major Owens was the first librarian congressman. He took Shirley Chisholm's seat when Shirley Chisholm died, and he worked in Bedford-Stuy. You all, just a little by the side, his son was recently on television. His son is Jeffrey Owens. And Jeffrey Owens played in The Cosby Show, Delvin. And the relationship that we had at that time was, okay, Michael, here's what I see the issue is. There needs to be an understanding of what archives are about in this community. And in general, people don't understand, because one of the problems I was running into was, why are you hiding our books from us? Why do we have to go through all this? When I was doing the Illinois Writers Project, I found out that the materials were greatly pilfered. They were stealing stuff. To this day, we had people come here, and I go pick up collections, and part of the collections that we picked up was some pilfered Illinois Writers Project papers. So I took them out of service, and so the Illinois Writers Project began, and we tried to save them. The line that I told Michael at that time, what we had to do was to educate the community, educate people, educate everyone on how to use the archives and everything. And Michael agreed. Michael was reluctant about teaching, as often it was said, but he was a teacher. He was an excellent teacher. He taught me. And to jump real quick, what I found out was I got a 3-for-1 sale. In one person, I got one of the best reference people for archives that I've seen in all my years, and I've had 3 or 4 years, 3 or 4 different systems of archival experience. But he was, by far, one of the best at doing reference in archives. Now, the second thing was this organizer. He can organize a collection, and he can take a point of view. He knew exactly what the black point of view was, or what, he would throw his little gist in there too, but the civil rights activism, because you can't take the rebel out of Michael. He's going to rebel. The most important part is the third thing I found out was this man could write. I mean, I had never seen anybody write the way he could. I used to give him, hey, here, Michael, take a look at this and tell me what you think. Then I get it back with all these scribbles in there and everything. I said, Michael, I just asked you to look at it. I didn't ask you to edit the thing, and he did. And the famous red line and all these squiggles, which he had gotten that experience from doing his union organizing, working in Detroit and everything. He wrote newsletters for CORE and everything. But he could write. And that was a great help. You know why? Because when he wrote finding aids, they were the compliments we would always get. Those are the best finding aids I have ever seen. The detail and the people coming here from England, Spain, all over the world using the collections. They had this experience that this is definitely what I'm looking for. Michael would do the interviews, and then Michael was also a great teacher, whether he liked it or not. He taught me. There were things about archives I didn't know, and he taught me, and he taught me well. But that squiggle, Michael, that's not what I wrote. And I looked at it, and I said, yeah, but he said, I'm just trying to make you sound better. Yeah, he made me sound better, all right. And then I said, still, it ain't what I wrote. And then I look at it, and then, you know what I say? He's right. It's better than anything I ever thought, and he really got to the gist of what I was trying to say. And his mother, his aunt, they had such an influence. Now the library spiel comes out of me. He had to read, and he read. He read books. Ever since he was a kid, he read books. His mother, a teacher, his aunt, a teacher, made him read books. I always asked him, I said, well, Michael, how did you get this way? But Michael, and then the diplomat in Michael was unusual. Don. Okay, sorry. But we got these 3-for-1 sale. Michael was all these things, and he worked like I never seen anybody work so hard. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Valerie Gerard Brown Motley.
I feel like we should have everybody stretch for a minute. But the number of people here today in honor of Michael Flug is a tribute to the impact of his well-lived, inspiring life. Michael and I had shared roots in the archival profession, as well as strong and lasting friendship that began in the 1970s. I'm retired as the founding director of the Women in Leadership Archives at Loyola University of Chicago. I'm also the widow of his friend Archie Motley. the renowned archivist emeritus of the Chicago History Museum, and son of celebrated African-American artist Archibald J. Motley, Jr. My friendship with Michael began when we were graduate students in archival. Okay, thanks. Okay. My friendship with Michael began when we were graduate students in archival administration at Wayne State University in Detroit. We were both doing internships in the Walter Reuther Library's Archives of Labor and Urban Affairs. I quickly learned and instantly respected that Michael walked his talk. By the time I met him in the 1970s, he was juggling his graduate school classes and organizing auto workers while working full-time in the City of Detroit's Human Rights Department. He was continuing his lifelong dedication to improving the lot of African Americans and working people, especially those who had little voice, and doing it with his trademark grace, impish humor, compassion, generous spirit, unflinching dedication, and brilliant mind. What is even more remarkable is that he accomplished all of this despite an acute hearing loss, which was the result of a myosin drug he had been administered for an earache when he was a child. I don't think many people actually realize that because he functioned so beautifully in the world. Following graduate school, I was hired as the archivist for the papers of Walter Reuther in Detroit, and Michael became the archivist of the Marxist humanist philosopher Raya Dunayevskaya in Chicago. After going our separate ways, our paths converged again when I married Archie and moved to Chicago, taking an archival position at Loyola University. Michael was now married to his beloved wife, Suzanne French, and had become a wonderful second father to her two sons, Mike and Kevin. Suzanne and Michael were amazing partners for each other throughout their long, loving relationship, their marriage, sharing social justice pursuits and bright minds. When Mike and Kevin married, they happily welcomed both the spouses of their two sons, Allison and David. And they later fell in love with their two grandchildren, Maddie and Russell. Over the years, Michael and Suzanne faced numerous health challenges together. I am sure that Suzanne's loving, astute care of Michael helped keep him alive much longer than many expected. I remember writing a letter of recommendation for Michael when he applied for the archival position at the Harsh, where he would gain so much acclaim. Bob Miller, whom you just heard, later told me that, and he just confirmed this, that what really made him decide to hire Michael was a phone call from Archie, who told him that he would be crazy not to hire this exceptional man. The rest, of course, is history in so many ways, and how grateful we all are. With the able assistance of Beverly Cook, what an amazing collection has been amassed to document the contributions of African Americans to our world. Archie and Michael were good friends and friendly rivals for collections that documented the lives of African American, the African American community, and the underdocumented in society. Archie had nothing but respect for Michael. Reporters and researchers alike learned that both men were founts of knowledge on African American history, labor history, radical history, and Chicago history. Michael also helped countless researchers, sharing his extensive knowledge with history fair students and seasoned researchers from every corner of the world, receiving high accolades in countless books. Though he never published much himself, he was an invaluable editor for the publications of numerous others, including me, and he mentored archival interns who cannot speak highly enough of him. In addition, Michael played important roles in professional organizations. He was proudest of the pivotal role he played in establishing the first scholarship for minority students by the Midwest Archives Conference. It became a model for the profession, a profession that recognized the crucial importance of diversifying in order to assure a more accurate and all-encompassing historic record. On a personal note, Archie and I were blessed in 1985 by our daughter, Mara. Michael and Suzanne became even more bonded to us after Archie's tragic fall at work in 2002. It left him critically brain injured and in a coma. Every day for nearly 3 months, Michael or Suzanne or both of them visited, even though both were working full-time. Mara and I could not ask for better friends. In fact, they are family to us, and their friendship is treasured beyond measure. Because we learned that hearing is the last faculty to go, we continued to talk to Archie. Then miraculously, at the end of his life, he began moving his lips and trying to speak. It was Michael's lip-reading ability that allowed him to quote-unquote hear us, quote-unquote hear Archie's last words to us. Mara and I will be forever grateful for this gift. In addition, Michael spoke eloquently at both of Archie's memorial services. He would then become Mara's surrogate father and her go-to person when wise counsel was needed. Suzanne and Michael attended Mara's graduation from high school, Northwestern, and UIC Medical School. They rooted her on when she ran the Chicago Marathon with a colorfully lettered sign, "It's a marathon." When Mara graduated from Northwestern, Michael wore Archie's conspicuous orange Tennessee sports jacket in honor of Archie's memory and to help her spot her family in the stands, while Suzanne held up a Mara sign that she had made. Michael and Mara also worked together for years at the Evanston Farmers Market for farmer John First, who paid them in produce. This allowed Michael and Mara to indulge their shared passion for blueberries, though I'm not sure if John ever came out ahead on that. I know that you all have your own stories about Michael. No one could ask for a better friend and colleague. Thank you, Michael, for leading with your heart, for your genuine interest in people and their welfare, and for living your life with integrity, humor, and grace. Bon voyage, my treasured friend.
The next speaker will be Alden Morris. Professor Alden Morris is the Leon Forrest Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University. He's also the author of an outstanding book, Scholar Denied, about W.E.B. Du Bois as the real founder of American sociology.
Good morning. I want to thank Lou Turner and all of the others who organized this magnificent memorial for Michael Flug. Certainly want to say to his family that we really thank you for sharing him with us. Michael and I were friends. Though friendship is a beautiful and precious thing, Michael was far more than a friend. He was a scholar, a nurturer, and keeper of the Black intellectual and social traditions. He was an activist, an organizer for social justice, a mentor, and an unmatched archivist who dedicated his prodigious talents to preserving and expanding the Vivian G. Harsh Research Collection of African American history and literature at the Woodson Regional Library on the south side of Chicago. Because I grew up not far from the Woodson, I had long known that it was a treasure of Blackness in our community. However, in 1990, I made a profound discovery, the Harsh Collection. As I conducted research for a book, I visited the Harsh Collection and was greeted by a heavy mustache bespectacled white man. I wondered why this white man held such an esteemed position in a black research collection on the south side of Chicago. I mused, he must be an affirmative action plan. Then he spoke kindly and with great knowledge about the collection. He directed me precisely to the materials that I sought. As I took a moment to reflect, I said, damn, Michael sounds just like a brother. When I finished my research for the day, I said, Michael, if you ever need any assistance from me to help you with this collection, please let me know. With that twinkle in his smile, he said, I will. About a week later, Michael called me and said, I'm taking you up on your promise to help. I wanted to say, Michael, when I said anytime, I didn't mean next week. Michael explained that a large portion of the Harsh collection was ill-housed and would crumble if new facilities with proper modern climatic controls were not installed and installed immediately. He added that these improvements would cost several $1 million. He informed me that the city and state officials were not likely to be very supportive of such an effort. I thought, Michael, you really know how to put hurt on a brother. I had absolutely no experience in this kind of venture. Michael sensed that I was feeling, how on God's good earth could I accomplish such a Herculean feat? He quickly responded, you would not be alone because we are recruiting a number of scholars, activists, and community people to organize into a society to get the job done. I thought, what do you mean by society? At that time, I was not aware that Michael had been an organizer in CORE during the Civil Rights Movement, and that he knew exactly what he had in store for this so-called society. Thus, in the early 1990s, we organized the Vivian G. Harsh Society. It consisted of at least a dozen, probably 2 dozen people from all backgrounds. Some have passed away now, but some are here in this audience today. Together, we struggled for several years against flesh and blood, against principalities, against rulers, until the Vivian G. Harsh collection was safely secured in the modern facility that it so richly deserved. Indeed, the society had achieved the grand vision of Michael and his colleagues. Over the years, I continued to work with Michael, serving on panels, raising money for the collection and for social justice struggles that were happening, and also helping him honor the gifts of all of those who labor in that kingdom of culture we formally embrace as the Black intellectual tradition. Michael, I say so long. I want the world to know that as you dipped in the Kool-Aid of Black culture, you understood, promoted, and preserved all of its fine, nuanced, beautiful flavors. So, Michael, thank you for all of your eternal contributions.
Our next speaker will be Kevin French, who needs no introduction. You've heard a lot about Kevin here. He's Kevin and Michael are Michael's sons. and Suzanne's sons, and he will be speaking about giving some remembrances of Michael as well. In fact, Kevin, Michael, and Suzanne, you should be credited with organizing, along with Beverly Cook and myself, organizing this memorial today.
Hello, and I just want to correct one thing. The photo display was actually done by Scott Dixon, so husband of Mara Motley, over there, scanned and produced all of that. So, and Valerie as well, sorry. So Michael's stepson, as you know. To start, I was going to make a joke about how I found Pop's retirement speech in his papers, which I did, and I was going to read it in its entirety here. And it was really, really long for those who attended that ceremony. But Pop wouldn't have liked that joke, as he was never fond of insult comedy. As a kid, and I was quite young when he moved in with us, I gave him a hard time about his bald head frequently, but he would diffuse it with a smile and a retort of, "What did you do, Kevin? Graduate from the Don Rickles School of Humor?" And I use this with my grandkids now, even though they have no idea who Don Rickles is. Those that knew him, as Valerie mentioned, said that he had a significant hearing loss, and he would often not think about the things that he clearly misheard. So a famous example in our house is my mother once said that her ATM card was scratched by a cheetah, and we were driving, so that's very hard for him to hear because he needs to read lips. So, sorry, I messed it up. Scratched by a key in her purse, and he said, exasperated, "What? Your ATM card was scratched by a cheetah?" And my mother responded with a very B. Arthur sarcastic response, saying, "Oh yes, da 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 da." But so he knew this didn't happen, but it was actually often quite useful, these retorts, to offset the frustration of having to repeat yourself all the time as a kid, especially when you're young and you have a very high voice. He wasn't often terribly mad with us, and often tried to keep our humanity in mind when dealing with problem situations. So in high school, I kept secret, hidden in my closet, a collection of alcohol. And I came home one day to see it laid out on the dining room table with my parents sitting at the table waiting for me. I thought I was dead. And instead, Pop said, "Kevin, please keep your alcohol on your desk, as some of this is quite dangerous, and we want to know what you were drinking so we can talk to you about it." My mom, who was never a delinquent in her life, muttered, "And I really would rather you not drink at all." For which Pop turned to her. He was a kid known for shooting a rabbi with a water pistol and unscrewing Christmas lights from neighbors' Christmas decorations. And when he was growing up, I think he understood a little bit better this situation, and he turned to her and he said, "Suzanne, we talked about this." And so that was the agreement. From both of them, I could see that they loved me and valued my safety and honesty above all else. He was a great teacher indeed. He imparted in me a great skill, and my brother as well, in analyzing what we see in red. For example, he frequently pointed out all white casts on television, subtle and not so subtle racist jokes, classism, misrepresentations. I remember asking him if he saw the movie The English Patient. He said, "Oh, I did, and I was really excited to see a movie set in Libya and Egypt, but it was ruined by a bunch of white people gallivanting in the North African desert." This awareness of authorship and bias is now being passed on as I speak to these issues with my children. His 10-year-old granddaughter, my 10-year-old daughter, has even taken on her own when watching programs to say, "There are no black people on this show. I bet this was made, I bet the person who made this is white." Or, "I bet this was written by a man." Oftentimes when we see horrible sexism in kids' shows. My son wants me to point out too, that how much he enjoyed talking about fish and fish in Lake Michigan with his grandpa, and how he was Grandpa was so proud of him when he caught a fish when we just visited just only a few days before all of this happened, and how much he misses him as well. I do want to point out one thing. The articles written about him have described him as white, and some people have said white here. And this is fair, as he did identify as such on forums and in impersonal conversations, recognizing that he had the privilege of whites and that much of the world saw him this way. Apart from TSA agents who could see a descendant of a Middle Easterner from a mile away, including he had a post 9/11 strip down to his underwear, which I have never seen my stepfather embarrassed. But when he talked about that incident, he was heavily embarrassed. However, he actually identified himself similarly to actually how the TSA agent saw him. So he was a Jewish person of Middle Eastern descent. And when we discussed how I felt a visitor in my own country when the Defense of Marriage Act forced me and my British partner to move to Canada to stay together, he expressed a similar sentiment about feeling a stranger as a Jewish person and also a Jewish person of Middle Eastern descent in his own country. It is that feeling that he had that gave him an affinity to others oppressed in this country and around the world. We've talked about all of his civil rights action. There's a story, when we went to my brother's college graduation, his college had cottonwood trees all around their courtyard, and it would put down these little white seeds that to us looked like feathers. And so we all said to my brother, why are there feathers all over the courtyard? And my brother likes to have a good joke with us. And he said, oh, it's a senior tradition. We rip open all of our pillows and dump them all out on the courtyard. Well, if anyone has ever seen Michael Flug mad, he was mad. And he said, and who's going to clean that up? And so my brother continued the joke and said, oh, the janitors, they'll take care of it. That's what they're there for. And if you've ever seen him enraged, and this is Michael Flug enraged, so it's still kind of down. And he said, the janitors are there for general maintenance. They're not there to clean up after privileged, college students who think that it's funny to blah, 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 continued on that vein. So I use that line whenever I see someone throw something on the ground or something like that. He's supportive of, for example, Palestinian equality in Israel, and he likened it to the situation in Northern Ireland, which was also very important to him, where he went in the 70s in solidarity with the Irish struggle. So I remember Pop, never much of a drinker in the time I knew him anyway. I'm sure some people like Lou, who's known me since before I was born, that he may have been back in the day. But he was drinking, sampling a little bit of Irish whiskey, Bushmills, which he would do a couple times a year. And I challenged him for drinking a Northern Irish whiskey instead of one from the Republic. And without missing a beat, he said, I don't recognize those borders, and continued sipping his whiskey. He loved Ireland so much that he and my mother asked my brother and I to join them on a trip as adults, to join them on a trip to Ireland, to their favorite spots. And I was so influenced by their love of Ireland growing up in their admiration of Irish culture. I took up learning Irish Gaelic and even attended immersion programs in some of those favorite spots of his. We also shared a love of archives, even though I am currently not employed as an archivist, because Nova Scotia doesn't really have many of those. If you know anybody, give them a call for me. But I completed my master's in archives management at Simmons College in Boston, and I had coursework with Jeanette Bastian, a scholar he admired who wrote extensively about colonialism and archives, and how the history of the oppressed is missing in the archives of the oppressors, or the oppressed are only seen in their lens. He agreed with her in the importance of fighting back against that phenomenon and the role of modern archives and archivists in correcting those omissions. It is the reason his retirement speech I told you about was so long, because he knew that an archivist with no records is useless. And he knew every single one of those African-American donors to the archives, and every single author, scholar, student, or community member that used them were filling in the intentional voids of collective memory and our shared identity. And so may we collectively remember my stepfather, my Pop, today. So thank you.
Did you want to go now? Do you want to go? Our next speaker will be Suzanne French Flug.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I have a lot of people to thank. I want to thank Commissioner Tully for allowing us to use this room. I want to thank all of you who came to the hospital on the terrible day that Michael died, with special thanks to my sons, Michael and Kevin, who came to my side so quickly. I also want to thank my other families, Valerie Brown, Mara Motley, and Scott Dixon, the Woodson Library family, and I mean that. The Woodson Library, no matter what department you're in, is a family. And especially Beverly Cook and Shirley Wallace, my sisters from another mother, Mercedes Cook. Also my daughter-in-law Allison, son-in-law David, and my grandchildren Madison and Russell. All of these sweet people have helped me in so many ways to lift my heart and keep me going. I'm also grateful to Maureen O'Donnell and Ben Jarofsky for the beautiful articles they wrote on Michael. There's also a new article in the Jewish Forward, and I'm going to take one exception to it. He says that Michael sat out the Vietnam War as a conscientious objector. And I guess people, young people don't even know that when you're a conscientious objector, you don't just say, no, I don't care to go. You get called into court and you have to prove that you have a history, a peaceful history of nonviolence and an opposition to war. And Michael had that. He worked with the American Friends Service Committee. He went to black churches all throughout the South to raise money for CORE, and so he won his case. So then you're declared a conscientious objector, but you don't sit out. You serve 2 years alternate service. They send you far away from your home so that you're sort of imitating the hardships that a soldier would have. So he worked at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, writing grants for programs for elderly and developmentally disabled people, that they would have things to do instead of just being left sit. Michael died on July 11th. July 14th, Bastille Day, would have been our 35th wedding anniversary. So I want to thank all of you for coming also. So now everybody's talked about Michael's professional life. So I'm going to do a little more personal things. Let's see. I'm going to skip over so we don't duplicate a lot of stuff. And Lou, I think, people told you how he got involved with the civil rights movement in the first place. But there's some things that I think had a real profound effect on his life. One was what somebody mentioned, that as a child, Michael was profoundly deaf. For 2 years, he had to be pulled out of his regular classes at school to go and learn lip reading. Now, that's kind of unusual for a kid. But it made me think that because you have to concentrate, you have to look at somebody so hard to see what they're saying, that affected the way Michael conducts a conversation with you. He's looking right at you, and he's really listening, and he's really paying attention. And that's why he's asking all these questions, probably to fill in maybe the blanks of some of the things that he missed. The most important event, I think, in his childhood was the death of his father when he was just 9 years old. By this time, his parents had moved from Brooklyn, his beloved Brooklyn. I mean, his parents were there. Brooklyn became beloved to Michael later, but they moved to Long Island, to a community made up of Jewish, Italian, and black families. Most of the Italian kids taunted and bullied the Jews and the blacks, so it was only natural that Michael would hang out with them. His father, Ben, was a chemical technician who was an organizer for the oil chemical workers, now the oil chemical atomic workers. At the time that he died of a fatal heart attack at age 36, he couldn't find a job in the chemical industry because he was under investigation by the House Un-American Activities Committee for his union organizing activities. He worked for Grand Rapids Brass in Grand Rapids, and that's the west side of Michigan, which was not unionized as the east side with Detroit and Flint had been. His father collapsed one day when he was out looking for work, and the police came to the house to tell his mother that he had died. Because his mother didn't allow him or his brother to go to their father's funeral, Michael refused to believe that his father had really died. He thought he had gone into hiding and convinced himself that he would come back when the situation became safe again and he wouldn't be haunted by the FBI every time he went to a meeting or something. He actually said he had nightmares. He would have dreams of his father coming back from various places. Let's see. Oh yeah, you heard about the stealing lights from neighbors. And that his group was called Idiots Incorporated. There were about 15 of them, and they did all these, Halloween-type pranks, breaking windows. They broke into the high school or to their grade school to write on the blackboards and everything, and they were finally caught. And a captain said, "You're nothing but a bunch of idiots." So they decided that's what they'd call themselves. His mother was a school teacher in the school district and did everything she could to keep him out of trouble. She sent him for 2 summers to work on a friend's dairy farm in Grand George, New York. Now, everybody knows that when Michael gets to something, he immerses himself in it. So he became a farmer. I mean, he would tell you everything. A good dog can get you an extra half hour of sleep because that dog can get the cows into the right stalls for milking. he spent what he called the worst summer of his life working as a waiter at Camp Cayuga in Holmesdale, Pennsylvania. He said he hated it and learned that, this is a quote, oh, that's right, I started to do an oral history on him, but didn't get very far. There were spoiled, nasty, rotten Jewish kids with way too much money who treated people like expletive deleted. In March 1960, they sent a educational psychologist, Dr. Lloyd Delaney, who was an activist in CORE, to meet with Idiots Incorporated. And Michael said he told them about the sit-down strikes in Woolworths in the South and said that they were going to try and start doing that in New York. And would they be interested? He said, if you guys want to go and call yourself Idiots Incorporated and that's what you want to do with your life, fine. But we've got something going on here that can really change the world. Michael thought it was a stupid idea. But the other Idiots Incorporated thought they would give it at least a try. So on one Saturday, they went to a huge Woolworths in downtown Brooklyn on a Saturday. Michael, like already said, he said, about 10 of them went and walked the picket line. They went early in the morning and walked it all day, and not 5 people crossed the line. Michael said, quote, "I felt great and was more proud of this than anything I've ever done in my life." He told Dr. Delaney he wanted to join CORE and joined that day. It was the end of Idiots Incorporated because some of them didn't want to be bothered. In Michael's words, quote, "And for the next 6 years, that's really all I cared about. I found something to do with my life and had a tremendous feeling that I was doing something right and good." Now, a lot of times when we'd be watching TV, a city would come up. Here's something going on in Durham. Oh, I was arrested there once. Here's something going on in Raw. Oh, I was arrested there once. So that's how I did the oral history. I said, oh, come on, you can't have been arrested in all these places. He was arrested 26 or 27 times. We don't have an exact count. And the one, let's see, he was picketing in his own the district where his own mother taught school. And she was worried, as the sole support of the family now after his father died, that she would lose her job. So she got a hysterical call from the superintendent of schools demanding to know whether she knew and had given permission for him to picket. She said no, she didn't know, but it didn't matter because she had no control over Michael. 2 weeks after he graduated, the summer of '62, the New York State Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Malvern, which was the district he lived in, had to desegregate all elementary schools. As it was then, all blacks went to one school and whites could pretty much go wherever they wanted. Okay, so let's see, what does this, now, in one of the articles, they called Michael a freedom rider. He was not actually a freedom rider, and I found out why. You had to be 18 to go on a freedom ride because the danger was that you were going to get the pulp beat out of you. So he was only 17. So he participated in the Freedom Highway campaign, which was testing public accommodations, where you'd go in and, sit down at Woolworths. A lot of Woolworths blacks could go and order food and take it out, but they could not sit at the counters. So that was the Freedom Highway campaign. So when they started bringing some of those type of activities to the north, Maryland was the nearest state to where he was that was going to do that. So at one point he went to Maryland, but he also went to North Carolina, and they had this demonstration. I don't even remember where it was, but they brought him up as a high school student who had come all the way from New York to North Carolina to speak. And that's when he said something like, "Good afternoon, brothers and sisters, I'm happy to be here." He was arrested for inciting to riot at age 17 and spent about 3 weeks in jail, and he was convicted. And in order to say to the city of Chicago that he did not improperly answer the question, "Have you ever been convicted?" he returned back when they appealed, and the charges were dropped on appeal. So technically, he was okay. So now I know, one of the other things he did was he worked on an Indian reservation, as they then called it, in Lame Deer, Montana. 25 students from all over the U.S. went to work on a construction project with Indian workers to build a craft center and extend a community center so the community could make and sell their own crafts. They were received warmly, and a man named John Stands in Timber, the oral historian of the Cheyenne people, lectured them during the day on Cheyenne culture. Michael said that he, quote, became much more sympathetic towards nonviolence as a way of life and not just a tactic. Okay, so now I have to go to my notes. Wait 1 second, I'm going to get my, Kevin, could you bring in the big notebook? I'll tell some little tales. So I think it was Ben Jarofsky said, you know, that when he would go and ask Michael questions, he seemed to know everything about everything. So I'll tell you a story. When we first moved to Chicago, we went to a Midwest Archives Conference picnic in Patrick Quinn's backyard, I think. And we saw Mara Motley as a little girl crawling all around. And so sometime after that, I was reading the Tribune. Michael did not like the Tribune, said it was a Republican paper. He read the Sun-Times, except for Howard Reich, whom he loves, and Dawn Turner Trice, who worked with him on about half of her columns. So I'm opening the paper, the Tribune, I think it's a Sunday. The entire centerfold is on this exhibit at the Chicago Historic Museum. And it's on Archibald Motley Jr., the painting. And so I said, Michael, is Archibald Motley Jr. related to Archie? And he said, no, Archie's not black. Obviously, everybody doesn't know Archie is black. His father was black. He was about my complexion, but he was black. This is a fairly significant thing to know about someone. And I said, well, it says right here that this is sort of being curated by his son, Archie Motley. It's not exactly a common name. So I thought, from the Republican Tribune, I learned something that the great historian did not know. And boy, he never lived it down, I'll tell you. Another little thing is, you know, when you're a professional archivist, you have to have really sophisticated professional tools. So if you have a contact list, you shouldn't have hundreds of little pieces of paper and everybody's business card all over everywhere, including in your clothes before they go in the laundry. So Michael, we made Michael a very sophisticated little bin to put all his cards in. It was one of those wet toilet tissue bins, you know, and we still have it at home with all of his contacts. That's how we found a lot of you. Okay, let's see what else we're going to say. So he had this one beautiful formulation that I think is written in your program about why interposing yourself into the fight against segregation not only changes the world, but it changes you because it makes you a human being. And I was looking for a quote, a really, you know, impressive quote to include in there, and I was looking at Yeats, and I was looking at all different places, and I thought, I'm going to use that quote from Michael because I loved it. I know at one time in New York Times, he was quoted in the New York Times as being so rebellious, and the New York Times reporter said, what are you rebelling against? And he said, I'm not rebelling against anything. My grandparents were radicals, my parents were radicals, I'm just continuing a family tradition. Okay, let's see. I know people have talked about, Michael has been a father figure to so many people. It was a great father to my kids. My kids were lucky enough to have two great fathers. So I'm going to read a poem that I think people may recognize, but I'll just read the last two stanzas. It's from W.H. Auden's poem, Stop All the Clocks. The last is, he was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest. My noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. The stars are not wanted now, put out every one. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood, for nothing now can ever come to any good. I always loved that poem, but I think it is wrong, and Michael wouldn't have liked it. Because if you look at the people around this room, I mean, I can't even believe it. The amount of love that's in this room, and if each person just goes out and contacts one person, it will live forever. And on and on and on. I mean, one time I was telling somebody we were at a rest stop coming back from my mother's in St. Louis on Highway 57. We're walking into the restrooms, and this little voice, "Mr. Flug, Mr. Flug." So we turn around, and it's a young African-American girl, and she comes running up, and she said, "You helped me with my history project, and I'm going to state." So I thought, you can't go anywhere. My grandfather was a math and science teacher in the St. Louis public schools for 30 years. Everywhere we went, it was the same thing. When you're a good teacher like that, people come up to you, and they're so grateful. There's also a quote that's supposed to be, it's attributed to Yeats, but then when you look it up, nobody can find where it is. And some say it's Plutarch, some say it's other people, but it's something like, the purpose of education is not to fill a bucket, it's to light a fire. And Michael lit a fire. And then I want to mention the song that's on our music. There's one song that I always said was Michael's 99 and a half won't do. Sometimes I wished he would settle for 99 and a half. I always thought when he had an exhibit up, and if he had two objects for the exhibit that weren't up on the day it was supposed to start, you would be like, "Michael, the faucet is blowing up in the kitchen. I can't do anything until the exhibit is over." And he knew everything about everything. But if you see the picture that comes up with him with the pot rack that's hanging in our kitchen, that's the extent of anything he does around the house. So thank you all for coming, and let's light more fires.
Fortunately, we're almost done. We have a couple more speakers, since they did come and prepare very short statements. Marcia Walker McWilliams. Is she here? Marcia. Oh. How many of it is there?
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for asking me to speak today. It's a really great honor to be able to talk a little bit about my relationship with Michael and the growing relationship that I had with Suzanne over the past few years. So, and I wrote these down hoping I can keep my composure, so I'm going to try to get through this. 12 years ago, I walked into the VB&G Harst Research Collection for the first time and met Michael Flug. And there was a bit of a setup. I had heard that a couple of days before that someone had actually fainted on a tour that Michael gave of the Harst. So I walked in, having had my breakfast, had some water. I was like, okay, I'm going to be able to make it through this really involved tour of the Harst. It turns out it wasn't that bad, and there was something else going on that, caused that person to faint. But there was definitely a lot of buildup to meeting Michael Flug and hearing about how involved his tours of the Harst were. I was there with a team of graduate students from the University of Chicago, all working on the Mapping the Stacks project to process hidden collections relevant to Black Chicago. And Michael was our on-site supervisor. I joined the team a little bit later than everyone else, so Michael gave me the tour, which I survived and did not faint. And he introduced me to Bob, Beverly, Denise, Lucinda, and Cynthia, who the Mapping the Stacks crew kind of dubbed, as the Harst family at the time. And I am here also speaking on behalf of a lot of my Mapping the Stacks alums. We are spread out across the country, from California all the way to the East Coast, and even into Europe. So when I shared the sad news that Michael had passed with them, we all just had this email chain talking about all the different ways that Michael had impacted our lives professionally. In fact, about half of us have actually gone on to careers outside of academia, working in archives and in libraries, in part because of the influence that Michael had. So he touched all of us quite a bit. Having Michael as a supervisor was like having a daily master class on what he called the movement. I recall being amazed by Michael and his immense knowledge on seemingly everything under the sun. If I knew something that he didn't, or I uncovered something in the archive that he didn't know about, then I really would feel like I deserved a Nobel or a Pulitzer, or at least a couple cookies, because he knew everything. In addition to working with Mapping the Stacks, I was interested in writing my dissertation on Reverend Addie Wyatt, who was a labor leader, feminist activist, and civil rights activist here in Chicago. I was actually really intimidated by Michael, and so I waited a little while to ask him if he would help me with that dissertation project. I sent him an email because I was too scared to talk to him in person, and I asked him if he would be willing to help me locate sources and also to help me meet Reverend Addie Wyatt. So he sent back an email and said yes to all. I didn't know at the time that he actually had dozens of unprocessed boxes from the Addie Wyatt collection in the hallway. So he knew that I was getting involved in a much bigger enterprise than I thought. But it was the start of a very long collaboration between Michael and I. For Mapping the Stacks, we worked on the Harsh Archival Processing Project in 2011, and then he also invited me to serve as a guest curator on an exhibit on Reverend Addie and Reverend Claude Wyatt papers over the course of 2012 and 2013. And when it was time for me to turn the dissertation on Wyatt into a book manuscript, Michael was right there as well, helping to open doors, reading drafts, and certainly showing me his talent with the red pen, and also encouraging, uplifting, and of course challenging me throughout. He was so proud when the book was published 3 years ago. Professionally, Michael helped open many doors for me and helped me to become the scholar that I am today. But he was much more than a supervisor, a mentor, and a colleague. He and I adopted each other as family. Despite big differences in our ages, our backgrounds, and our appearances, we thought a lot alike and shared many of the same values. And sometimes if we went out to lunch together alone, we would get a lot of curious stares from people like, what is going on here with this older, seemingly white gentleman with this young black woman here? And he would always tell them, oh, it's okay, she's my daughter. Michael actually deemed himself my in loco parentis, which is Latin, and it translates to in place of parent. He would also joke and say that it meant he was my crazy parent as well. So that's how he would sign off on his emails, and I would sign off as his adopted daughter. He was a father figure that I sorely needed in my life. He could sense when I was tired, when I was sad, when I was upset, or questioning my path and challenging myself. And he would take the time out of a busy day to just sit down and talk with me. How am I doing? What's going on? How can he be of help? And when I told him that I had to stop working on the Harsh Archival Processing Project because I was moving to Texas with my then boyfriend, now husband, Michael said, Marsha, I trust your character, but I gotta meet this brother. So they met, they liked each other, things worked out well, and to this day, they developed a pretty good relationship. But he constantly implored me to see my own worth, not only as a scholar, but as a young woman. And I, like a daughter, always wanted to make him proud, and still do. I wanted to see him happy, and I wanted to see him healthy. So if he wasn't eating lunch like he should, or he just had a bag of Fritos, I would say, Michael, you need to go and eat lunch. You cannot work like you do without, having subsistence. There were also a few times when Michael checked me. He would not hesitate to let you know if you weren't quite on the up and up, or as they say, woke these days. We would often talk about food, particularly soul food spots in Chicago, and I would name a few places that I had been to. And Michael would just look at me and shake his head and say, oh, while you were there, did you see the industrial-sized can openers they had? For him, it was not soul food if it wasn't fresh and it wasn't homemade. So he told me I kind of had to step my game up in the food department, and I did. He also checked me about my jazz and blues knowledge. One day when we were discussing music, Michael was downright flabbergasted when he brought up the name Lionel Hampton, and I had no idea who he was talking about. So that was a big no-no. It got even worse when he said the name Bobby Blue Bland, and I was still clueless. I'll never forget the look of shock, pity, and actually a little bit of disgust that came across his face. So he looked at me and he said, "How do you not know these people?" So that look inspired me several years later to stay up and watch a rerun of the BET show Unsung on Bobby Blue Band. The next day after I had seen it, I wrote Michael an email telling him all I had learned about Bobby Blue Band and that I had educated myself, and he was quite pleased. But I also got back at him. Michael was known not to carry a cell phone, and so I would often chide him and say, "Oh, Michael, I tried to reach you on your," "Oh, wait, you don't have a cell phone." And that would then prompt this long diatribe about why he did not have one. And on a particular day when Michael came to the Harsh, and we had folks from the University of Chicago coming to interview us, Michael had gotten a cold. So his voice was like really, really deep and gravelly, and he had kind of had his Brooklyn accent going. So I took to calling him the whole day Don Miguel, and he didn't like that at all. He said he was not some mobster gangster boss. A few months ago, I gave Michael the news that my husband, Leon, and I were moving back to the Chicagoland area after living in Texas for nearly 8 years. And I could tell that he was really happy about that. I also knew he never wanted me to leave in the first place, but he let me go. And I knew he was happy because not 10 minutes after we had discussed it, he started sending me tons and tons of job postings, like apply here, apply here, apply here. And while there were many reasons why I looked forward to returning to the Chicagoland area, spending more time with Michael and getting to know Suzanne better was high at the top of that list. It's bittersweet to be back, but to have lost Michael. He found ways, big and small, to make an impact in the lives of others and in the lives of those he loved. He didn't like the spotlight, but his life, his work, and his heart are worthy of so much praise. I'm so grateful to have known him and to have loved him. He will always be my in loco parentis, and I will forever be his adopted daughter.
Okay, we're winding down here. Our next speaker is Melvin Thompson, Executive Director of Endaleo Institute from the Trinity Church of God in Christ. It's on 95th Street. It's a famous church, and it had a lot to do with the rehabbing of the Woodson Regional Library. Melvin.
Everyone who's your color ain't your kind. And everyone your kind ain't your color. Someone very radical at Trinity United Church of Christ said that more than once. Our pastor emeritus, Reverend Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright Jr., a very misunderstood brother, and that phrase has stuck with me ever since Lou shared the news of Michael's passing. In a really divisive nation right now, we really need to look across color, and I think Michael personified that. I didn't know Michael, and I'm probably one of the few people in the room that didn't, but I was in the room with him at Woodson many days, and I was in earshot of him holding court many times, and just kind of having people just entrenched in his conversations. I did some research because I didn't know the legacy of Michael Flug, and I know I've heard his ethnic background and all that, but he's a brother. He's a brother all day long. I mean, that vernacular, he's a brother. And so I think it would be sacrilegious to say I Googled him. You don't Google Michael Flug. You research Michael Flug, because the things that I've heard in this room today, you're not going to find that electronically. And so this is one of the key elements of why libraries are so important, and why maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I had this crazy idea in our Washington Heights community that we could do something simple, significant, and salient in our community by restoring a public library that is a treasure in our community and probably not that well known to the people who actually live there about the Harsh collection and the treasure trove of African American literature that Michael so wonderfully curated. And so I've got to say that Commissioner Telly, you are a breath of fresh air. Thank you. You weren't appointed, you were anointed for this position. Andrea was critically important in the often, believe it or not, contentious dialogue between the community and the city in terms of trying to get that library restored. And so Andrea was our bridge. And she, you know, now that she's the boss, I know the boss. So that's real cool. And I asked her when I first got here if Michael had had the opportunity to come in and see. Has everybody been to the Woodson Library since it's reopened? Show of hands real quick. Okay, cool. That's about half of you. That's your job, to go to the Woodson Library, honor Michael that way. It's just been a pleasure, and I hope Michael will be proud. One of the things we wanted to do beyond the physical improvement was to accent the incredible history and the narrative of our people. I've said this to young people all the time. I'm in a room right now with Tim Black. I'm in a room with Samuel Black, okay? Our young people need to see him and listen to him, sit on a porch with him, and understand our history, the real narrative to who we are and the shoulders we're standing upon. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are a walking legend. And I think if we knew as a people who we are and whose we are, some of the self-inflicted harm that we do to each other would really dissipate. And so, again, beyond the physical improvement of that library, we hope that the 26,000 people who come through the turnstiles of that library every month, think about that, 26,000 people will be exposed to this incredible curator of our history. I'm glad to hear that he loved gospel, because one of my favorite gospel tunes at Trinity is, I give my life away so you can use me. And I just want to thank, on behalf of Trinity, the Washington Heights community, and the far south side, the city of Chicago, we thank you, Michael, for your gift, and God will receive you now. Thank you.
I want to take one little, again, prerogative, since this comes off, and ask Tim if he wants to say it. We weren't sure whether you want to be here.
Well, I think I can say with accuracy to all of you here, I used to be your age. And all of that time is spent on the south side of Chicago, but been all over the world. And Michael Flug was an inspiration to continue. Could talk forever about Michael Flug in a positive way, but that's been expressed. But if I wanted to know something about another human being who was doing anything, I called Michael. And I would get that information pretty soon. That's how inspirational and informational he was to me, and I'm sure to others. So that loss is a physical loss, but emotionally and psychologically it will never be lost. We carry forward the legacy of Michael Flug. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Lou?
Yeah.
He said he's been our age. Can you tell us how old he is now?
Tim, can we?
Oh, 100 years and 7 months. Again, and that was one the thing that Michael carried forward with his work, that I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, December the 7th, 1918, and when things were so difficult in Alabama at that time and in Birmingham, that when I was 8 months old, the story goes, I looked around, saw what was going on, and I said to my mama, shit, I'm leaving. Carried that history with me to Chicago. And Michael was one of the persons who helped to put that history into the Vivian Harsh collection as I remembered it in terms of my memory. And he would come by and insist that I give him some of that garbage. So again, Michael is a person whose behavior it is to revere and continue and pass on to our younger people. That history by the people who lived it, unless it is recorded, is irreplaceable, and they can't see and understand the positive attitudes of our ancestors unless they can read and see that history. Life goes on, and Michael was a person who preserved that in a way that you could understand it and appreciate it. Sorry to talk so long, but
We did have a few statements that people did send, and I did want to at least share some of one of them, maybe more, hopefully. This is from Gwen Rice, who used to be my boss at Developing Communities Project, and there's a whole story that her statement will tell you about and how Michael's role. A lot of what we've heard is about Michael as an institution builder. Things get preserved by ways of institutions, but the institutions have to be there, have to be preserved themselves in order to save what Tim and others have talked about today. Anyway, Gwen Rice sent this remembrance of Michael and actually her own personal remembrance of her father, who was a doctor down in Yazoo, Mississippi. It's called Michael Flug, Masterful Archivist. Little did I know that when I first met Michael Flug, that he would be the key archivist to begin launching my family's history into posterity. While I met Michael on occasion, I came to really understand who he really was through the numerous and wonderful conversations that his dear friend and my coworker, Lou Turner, shared with me. It was a serendipity to later learn that Michael was the chief archivist on the papers of my father, Dr. Audley M. Mackle, a dentist and civil rights activist. In the 1940s and 1950s in Natchez, Natchez, Mississippi, and even earlier in Monroe, Louisiana, he had been actively engaged in the quest for equity and equality for then Negroes, including getting our people to vote during a time of poll taxes and other voter suppression methods, as well as his active service on the National Board of the NAACP during the Brown v. Board of Education. In 1956, these efforts and others forced our family to move in secret to Chicago. Michael linked my father's work with the work of so many others, much of which I was not even aware of. That was the genius of Michael. He connected information such that it elevated its significance to the history of others and thereby to the world. Only 4 years ago, when Developing Communities Project, or DCP, folded, several of us who had been associated in prior years with the organization were able to gain access to the papers before they were abandoned, really shredded. DCP is the organization where President Barack Obama was a community organizer for 2 years in the early 1980s. Though papers associated with the organization under Obama's leadership were in part missing, Michael knew that the remaining 28 years of the organization were critical to understanding the role of DCP and the many community collaborators such as churches, schools, community agencies, elected officials, et cetera, to the history of the community and to community organizing. Among some of the significant work of the organization was getting a public library built in Oakdale Gardens, opening the Chicago School for Agricultural Science, the Ag School, to any student in Chicago, and to its most recent transportation equity campaign, the extended CTA Red Line to Chicago's Riverdale community areas that includes the isolated Oakdale Gardens. The Red Line extension is the largest public works project in the history of the CTA. $2.6 billion. Michael and members of the Harsh staff moved 153 cartons from the premises. Just shortly after that, archiving had begun. A history of Greater Roseland movements was an exhibit on the Harsh collection for the world to see because Michael had connected the dots. Michael loved his work. He loved to tell the stories. He loved people and our interconnected histories. He was fully and masterfully engaged in archiving and what that work means to posterity. Because of him, I have become an advocate of archives and their work and as I encourage families, churches, organizations, and other institutions to submit their materials to the Vivian Harsh collection as well as other relevant collections because they are all indeed significant. Thank you, Michael, for so wonderfully fulfilling your calling in this life. Gwendolyn M. Rice. We have one statement from a longtime friend and comrade of Michael's, Michelle Gubbe. She's now living in Los Angeles. She was also had been a member of the News and Letters committees in Detroit. I met Michael on Thanksgiving Day, 1975, at a gathering of the Detroit home of the revolutionary Marxist humanist philosopher, activist Raya Dunayevskaya, with whom he had been working for a decade and with whom he would continue until Dunayevskaya's death in 1987. This was already the second chapter of Michael's adult life. Working with Dunayevskaya Dunayevskaya's Marxist humanism was the direction that flowed from what he knew in the core of his being following his years in the early 1960s Black South. I heard him tell stories of this, his eyes shining, the knowledge that when people join in movement, inspiring each other with their self-development and the self-developing ideas of freedom, they can change the world. When I met Michael, it was clear that it was this knowing and vision that was the foundation of his life. For those who knew Michael only from his years at Woodson, I ask you to picture him during his years with Marxist humanism. Michael would meet 1 week with rank-and-file Detroit auto workers and attend a conference of Hegel scholars the next week, talk to a crowd of radicals at a pub in Ireland, correspond with East European dissidents against communist totalitarianism, host South African freedom fighters, travel to Mississippi to meet women union organizers, and at Dunayevskaya's request obtain a degree in archival science because it was Michael with his keen intellect, depth of sensitivity, and lived experience in mass movements that Dunayevskaya trusted to organize the thousands of pages of her archives as a legacy for the future. The evening of the day I learned of Michael's passing, I attended a candlelight vigil in solidarity with migrants at our country's border in Los Angeles. There was a choir singing, I hadn't expected this, songs from the 1960s freedom movement. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. The choir knew how to burst the history inside these songs out into the world of 2019, singing so that our anger and grief might transform into the energy and love we need in these times of pain and madness. I thought to myself, there's no better way to remembering Michael than by being here with the songs that were part of his revolutionary birth and carrying that legacy forward into today, tomorrow, always the hope and vision of Michael's extraordinary life for a transformed world. I think we have one other speaker, maybe two. Is a James Flug here? Thank you. It's cousin Michael's.
I had informed the leaders of this operation that I would be glad to step down from this rostrum because my stories of Michael are just not as good, not as important, and not as good a teaching tool as what we've seen. So I'm going to pass. I will probably put some of them down on paper and send it to the library, and they can do what they would like with it. But all I can say is that we had a wonderful time with him. Thank you.
And we have also Peter Ehrenhaus, who's a cousin of Michael's.
Hi, I'm Peter Ehrenhaus. There was a song written a number of years ago called Jesus, the Missing Years. I have something of the same take. I grew up with Michael in a suburban house, a two-family house on Long Island, along with my older sister and Mike's younger brother. My parents, sisters, and I lived upstairs. My Aunt Shirley, Michael, and his younger brother John lived downstairs. You already know that Michael lost his father when he was very young. Well, despite our proximity in this upstairs-downstairs dual-family house, my Aunt Shirley, who is fiercely independent, took up the task of raising her two sons as a single parent while she pursued her own career. And when the entryway door to their downstairs apartment was closed, those of us living upstairs were not to intrude, particularly on their dinner time. But when that door was ceremoniously opened and my Aunt Shirley called up the staircase, okay, we could come down and catch up on each other's days. The two families blended into one on occasions such as these, as well as on many holidays. Well, Michael and I, and he's about little over 7 years older than I was, so think of this from a 7-year-old boy's perspective. We're raised in families where current events and politics were routinely discussed and argued at the dinner table and elsewhere. Reading newspapers was a daily ritual from which frequently sprang overlapping conversations, sometimes contentious and often loud, and always arising from moral outrage or exasperation about international, national, or local scenes. We were raised in families in which books of all kind and on all subjects were valued. And if you've seen the slideshow, there is this one wonderful image just of books on bookshelves at the place on Columbia. And the things that we read were to be delved into, returned to, and read against each other, not just accepted, but critically interrogated. Learning for its own sake was celebrated as a lifelong pursuit in this household, but learning that formed the basis of critical engagement and action to craft a better world, well, that was of greatest significance in our home. We were told with pride about our heritage, stories of escape from Jewish persecution, and that our grandfather had routinely voted for first Eugene Debs and then Norman Thomas for president every time he ran. Passover seders that we celebrated as children transformed into freedom seders in adulthood. Well, it's from this tradition that I see Michael's life trajectory, fusing a scholarly engagement with the world with dedicated activism. And there's no need for me to recount that because so many of you have spoken so eloquently about that. As I see it, Mike's passion as an archivist was due to recognizing the undeniable significance of memory, of remembering, of foregrounding the past, what must be remembered and celebrated, and what must be remembered to be redressed and remedied, to provide context for understanding our contemporary moment, to provide resources for celebrating community, and to persevere through collective action in struggles against social, institutional, and political structures of privilege, exclusion, and racism. But there was more to Michael than a lifetime of dedication to craft a more equitable society. You need to know that despite Michael's reputation as a highly ethical person, as a young teenager, he took inordinate pleasure at cheating in touch football. He reveled in misdirection plays, and as our backyard quarterback, he would often feign long passes and then stick the football under his t-shirt in order to run for a touchdown. Michael's love of Ireland as a place of the Irish people and of the Irish struggle for independence was more than historical and emotional. It was also gustatory. He introduced me as a young man to Guinness, and we had numerous conversations and debates about the relative merits, Jameson's or Bushmills. It's like Apple or Android. Well, when I was a small boy in the late 1950s, I would make secret forays into Michael's bedroom to explore the mystery that was essentially my big brother. One entire wall of Michael's bedroom was filled with bookshelves, not surprisingly, arranged so high that I had to get a stepladder to reach the top shelf. Each shelf was overflowing with books. I recall my sense of amazement as I would peruse the length of each shelf, using my finger to guide me from book to book, reading each title, but not necessarily understanding what each title meant. I also remember a globe that Michael had on his dresser. Attached to the brass frame that supported this globe of the earth, Michael had woven a series of rigid wires circling the globe at different trajectories and angles. And on each one of these wires, he had fashioned a small ball of clay. Attached to each of the wires was a small piece of paper with the name of a brand new satellite that was now circling the planet. My 7-year-old conclusion: Michael was really smart. And prominently displayed on one of his walls was a poster of none other than Sophia Loren. My 7-year-old conclusion: Michael really likes girls. Well, the last time I spoke with Michael was less than 3 weeks before he passed away. Our conversation followed an exchange of emails that began with my sending him a brief message with a photo of a road sign that simply read, "Lame deer." My wife and I were returning to Washington State from a driving trip that had taken us to South Dakota. Our route took us through the southeast portion of Montana. As we passed through Lame Deer, Montana, seat of the Northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation, I made a point of snapping a quick photo of the road sign announcing that we were entering the town. I then sent it to Michael in an email that read, "This was a while ago for you." Upon receiving the email, he replied in part, "Dear Peter, I worked on an American Friends Service Committee project in Lame Deer for 2 months in the summer of 1961. It was an eye-opening experience in many ways. I still have books, pamphlets, and clippings about the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, and I learned a great deal about the day-to-day experiences of Native Americans. Ever the archivist, even at the age of 16, and even then engaged by the manner in which communities share the joys and challenges of living life in this nation. Michael's death is a loss for all of us, and most especially for Suzanne and Kevin and Mike. May his memory be a blessing for all of us."
I think that's everybody that I have. I want to thank everyone who has come out. I'm sure people will stick around and talk amongst themselves, talk amongst yourselves, with remembrances of Michael. I tried to get us through here in 3 hours. I think I did. But definitely want to thank Andrea Telly, because it wasn't for her intervention to provide this wonderful space for us to meet and to remember such an extraordinary life lived with purpose. We would have been out on the sidewalk doing it in the spirit of Michael. He was my best friend, and he was my closest comrade, and I will ever miss him. Thank you all, and continue to come down to the Harsh and to Woodson Regional Library. It's Michael's spirit you will find there forever.